careful we don't get on too long on things.
Well, good morning, Sir William. May I first welcome you to Bracknell and thank you for agreeing to participate in our conversations this morning. Now, your service career spanned 44 years, from Royal Naval Air Service pilot to Chief of the Defence Staff. Now, clearly, we should need many, many conversations to cover every item of interest in that span. So I should like, if we could, to concentrate on those contributions of yours which were unique, almost, to the Royal Air Force, and perhaps to draw upon, as far as we can, your reflections and thoughts on events as they happened, rather than as they appear, perhaps after this length of time. And I wonder if we could go back to the very beginnings of your interest in the service, because I believe you are a direct descendant of Lord Nelson, but in World War I, you elected to join the Royal Naval Air Service. Why was that? What prompted your interest in flying?
Well, if we say go back to the beginning, we will go back to the beginning. This was in the middle of the First World War. In 1914 it started, and I was a schoolboy at a school called Imperial College, and there was 2 years to go before I became 18, 1914 to 1916, and I had to make up my mind what service I was going into. I was a typical schoolboy, not a very bright one, typical of my generation, just pretty patriotic and all that. There was no question about not going into the service. But my inclinations were, for the reasons you said, to go into the Royal Navy. I was proud of my connection with the famous Admiral. But then things began to happen. You know, flying was very much in people's minds. And I don't know quite what sparked the great interest in flying. It was a number of things. I had a motor bicycle. I used to go off to Hendon to see a cousin flying at Hendon. And then there were these old school friends who used to come back from the Western Front when they were on leave, and we used to sit around and listen to all their stories. And I used to be particularly sort of enthralled by their stories of the antics of the fighter pilots and what they thought and what they did. And that really did put a spark into me, and that decided to me that it should be the Royal Naval Air Service, not the Army, the RFC. I could sort of compromise my mind between the Navy, not joining the Navy proper, so it was the Royal Naval Air Service that should be. And so I left the school before I was 18 and 17, went to try and learn something more about airplanes and aircraft engines, and I joined up with an aircraft engine factory called the Anzani Company near Hendon, and then I got a commission from there, by good luck, as a flight officer in the Royal Naval Air Service.
You didn't immediately become a fighter pilot, though, did you?
No, I didn't. We all went to the Crystal Palace, which was being commandeered for an RNAS training establishment. We were licked into shape there. And then it was rather a disappointment for me. I was posted not to land planes, I was posted to seaplanes. And I went to learn to fly, of all places, you'd hardly believe it, at Lake Windermere, and to learn to fly on a very fragile two-seater flying boat called an FBA. I've forgotten what the initials stood for. And I was a bit disappointed. But anyway, I was in. And with all enthusiasm, all of us, we went up to Windermere. We didn't finish our training there because for various reasons it was impractical. But I went down to Calshot and finished my flying training there, and I was posted to a station called the Isle of Grain, and my operational career started doing anti-submarine patrols over the North Sea. And of course I was keen and did them, and my fighter planes seemed rather far away. And then a bit of luck happened, because in this place, the Isle of Grain, which was a sort of the RNAS Farnborough, it's an experimental establishment, it also had this operational unit there, which I was in. And in this, we had 2 or 3 little Sopwith baby twin-float seaplanes, beautiful little airplanes, and I was itching to fly these, and I persuaded my flight commander to let me have a go on one, and soon I became, I was flying them more than I was flying the old short seaplane. They were there, actually, as a it seems rather absurd, but they were there as part of the air defence of the Thames Estuary. And London was being subjected to the occasional raid then by these Gotha bombers. Yes. Anyway, I was scrambled several times to go up and try and intercept these Gotha raids, and these little baby seaplanes, I say, were a delight to fly, but they hadn't much performance. We couldn't get to the altitude of these bombers, and I was frustrated. And then another bit of luck happened to me, because in this aircraft establishment, there were one or two Sopwith pups there, the little fighters they had in the Western Front. And I set my heart on and tried to fly one of these. And so things were very elastic in the Isle of Grain in those days, and I somehow managed to persuade someone to let me convert myself onto a land plane, and before long, I was flying a Sopwith pup whenever I got the chance. And there were one or two pilots there who were very good aerobatic pilots, and I, in my sort of very untutored way, was trying to sort of copy them in aerobatics in a Sopwith pup. And then another bit of luck happened to me, luck in the way that I wanted to get onto the fighters, that the Admiralty had decided to choose the Isle of Grain to form a flight, a special flight, which was to form the complement of a new aircraft carrier called HMS FURIOUS. And the flight was to consist of fighter pilots there at the Isle of Grain, and to get ready there, ready to join the ship up at Newcastle. Well, the bit of luck was that they were short of one pilot. And I used to meet them in the mess and knew them all very well. And I think whether it was my enthusiasm in flying the pup and my anxiety to join them and get away from flying those old seaplanes, they took me on. I mean, it wouldn't happen these days, but that was. And so I joined up in this special flight. And then, I forget the exact date, we all moved up, and that's what the Navy say, we commissioned. We, every sailor or officer, when he joins the ship and it commissions, you say, I commissioned HMS FURIOUS. Well, I commissioned HMS FURIOUS in June 1917. And then in due course, we went up and joined the fleet, the Grand Fleet, under the Commander-in-Chief Beatty, and we became part of the Grand Fleet. Now, you probably want to know what I did in the Grand Fleet. Well, the story of the fighter operations with the Grand Fleet is too long for us to talk about now. But in general, at that time, the Grand Fleet was being frustrated or thwarted by these German Zeppelins and a few German seaplanes operating from the island of Sylt, which would come out and watch what the ships of the fleet were doing, where they were laying minefields and all that. And don't forget that the Grand Fleet of the Royal Navy was trying to have another Jutland, another contact with the German High Seas Fleet, how to tempt them out. Well, because of all this reconnaissance, they were being thwarted. And so the idea was to have fighters with the fleet. And the FURIOUS was very important because it was one of these new sort of almost a battle cruiser. It had great speed, enormous length, 30-knot ship, and it could operate on the far side of the North Sea, where we could do our sort of interceptions, much greater chance of interceptions there. And so we did a lot of time there. We didn't actually all through until I flew first pups we had, and then we had Sopwith Camels, and I think we kept the Zeppelins under control, but we didn't really succeed in eliminating the Zeppelin threat until we tied two 50-pound Cooper bombs underneath our Sopwith Camels and did a very carefully planned low-flying attack on the German Zeppelin base at a place called Tondern in Schleswig-Holstein. And that really sums up the fighter operations with the fleet.
If I could just refer to a more specific aspect of flying from the FURIOUS, it wasn't the sort of flat top that we are familiar with now, was it? It was a superstructure on the top of the...
FURIOUS was a converted super cruiser.
Yes.
She had one big 18-inch gun, 18-inch gun in the stern. Yes. They'd taken out the 15-inch guns in the bows, and they'd built on a hangar, and over above it this long, great flying off-deck. And in the hangar were our Sopwith pups and a couple of old seaplanes.
This must have presented problems, though, on landing and taking off. What about problems of turbulence, for example? From that
well, you see, our method of operating it sounds ridiculous because we used to take off on a scramble from the ship, either in the hope of catching a Zeppelin in the at dawn when they wouldn't know we were sort of under them. And when we'd finished our sortie, we had to land in the sea. we had to ditch our airplanes in the sea. It wasn't as dangerous as it sounds, but it was a bit unpleasant, because we had flotation bags in the fuselage which kept the aircraft afloat sufficiently long for us to be picked up, and there was always a destroyer to come along to pick you up, and we landed discreetly and just in front of the destroyer. But when we came back into harbour at Scapa Flow, and we used to do our exercising from a little airfield in Scapa Flow called Smoogru, and we used to do our air firing and training there, and we used to kept on thinking this idea of landing in the sea was nonsense. So us pilots, it started really with the idea of us pilots. We used to fly alongside the ship when she was at anchor and roll our wheels along that long flying off deck, and it obviously seemed to us, but why don't we land back on that instead of landing in the sea? And that's how it all started. Now the captain of the ship reported this, and we kept persuading him, and so official trials were agreed by the Admiralty. A lot of people came up, and we did the first official deck landing trials on the Furious. They were a moderate success. We did 2 successful landings, and then unfortunately the third landing, our CO, he didn't make a very good landing, but he went over the side and was drowned, and so they said stop everything. We were really annoyed. But that was the beginning of the deck flying with the Royal Navy. The whole concept of the modern aircraft carrier followed from that. So that really is interesting in retrospect.
Yes, yes. So when we come then to the end of the war, or near the end of the war, I suppose the next major landmark must have been the amalgamation of the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps.
Yes, well...
And a great deal, forgive me, sir,
yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, a great deal has been written at the high level about the implications of that amalgamation. But how did it feel to a Royal Naval Air Service officer suddenly to become, on the 1st of April 1918, a Royal Air Force officer? Was there any impact at all?
Well, it's a good question. The Staff College all knows all about the history. I just won't go through that again, but I mean, it was one of the necessities of war. A few sensible men up at Whitehall had seen that we never get on top of the German Air Force the way they were going on, the Admiralty quarrelling with the War Office about resources. There were limited resources, and the only way was to get on top of the German Air Force to put the task of developing this new form of military power, air power, in the hands of a single service given this single task, and that was the needs of war. Well, that's how it happened. Well, as you say, suddenly on the 1st of April 18, it was all announced, and it didn't really, to answer your question truthfully, make a pennyworth of difference to us. We, apart from changing into funny uniforms and changing our ranks, we went on doing precisely the same operations and the same activities as we'd done before. But as the sort of weeks went by, we began to think this wasn't a bad idea. It was only happened slowly to us. And I think it's rather complicated to explain, you see, that there was a difference between us and our sailor friends in the ship. They were very highly professional seamen in their various specializations, but we were, don't forget, flying hadn't started so very long before, and we felt different. I won't say superior, but different. We felt we had this new thing, which is exciting, and it was a thing of the future, and always this joy of flying, and so we felt different. They were quite nice to us, and I think they admired us, and they called us birdmen and all that sort of thing. But nevertheless, we felt that really we were separate sort of people, and it was up to us to show what aeroplanes could do. And so this, I say, and then we sort of knew all about the RFC and what they were doing in the Western Front. We also began to think, well, we're all flying people. It wouldn't have been much better. This idea of being one service, being all flying men from the top to the bottom was better, because we hadn't much faith in our senior officers in the Navy in those days. I mean, they were very fine chaps, these old admirals, but they didn't, and we knew they didn't quite understand what our problems were, what our requirements were. It was up to us to show them and tell them, but that made us again feel different. So gradually this idea of being a united flying service with the Army, we didn't like the idea of, we used to joke about the maternity jackets of the RFC. We were all clean chaps in white shirts and got up and went on the dawn patrol completely a sort of aseptic, whereas they used to put their maternity jackets over their pyjamas and go into action. Was completely disgusting. But And also, of course, we had a very high esprit de corps, as they had in the RFC and the RNAS. And losing our identity was a bit of a thing. But I say, gradually it began to make sense.
Yes.
And that you asked what it felt to the most. And that, as time went on, it began to make a lot more sense.
And of course, this was confirmed for you by the award of a permanent commission, wasn't it, at the end of the war?
Well, at the end of the war, it didn't happen until about August 1919. I won't go on what happened between then. The war ended. I went on to the staff of the Commander-in-Chief Grand Fleet, who changed, became Sir Charles Madden. David Beattie went to be First Sea Lord. But I became really what was the equivalent of the first Fleet Aviation Officer. They had a Fleet Gunnery Officer, a Fleet Torpedo Officer, and a Fleet Navigation Officer, all there. I was really the first Fleet Aviation Officer on the staff of the Commander-in-Chief. So I had a good view of what the sort of admirals were thinking about things then. And then, as you say, I went on with this deck flying experiments and then this extraordinary thing happened that on the 1st of August, I think it was, 1919, the first permanent commission list for the Royal Air Force, the officers who were going to be offered permanent commissions in this new Royal Air Force, came out, and my name was in it. And of course, I was absolutely astounded, and all of us were completely thrilled. But don't forget this, I don't remember what the list was, but it was a very small list compared to the total number of officers at the end of the war, which is very large indeed. But the economy was now the order of the day. The Air Force was going to start in a very small way. It got brought right down to bedrock, and therefore it didn't want many officers, and I was in that list. And I think all of us in that list had the same feeling as I had, that we felt now that it was up to us to, in this new service, given a single task, single service, it was up to us. You know, and that was a great thing stands out in my memory, that first list.
Yes, and in this same period, if my memory serves me right, you were either about to undergo or just undergoing a flying instructor's course with Smith-Barry before going on to development flying at Farnborough.
Well, again, the Staff College has probably read about this famous chap, Smith-Barry, who started a new system of flying training, which really was a marvellous system of flying training, and it became the basis of flying training of the Air Force afterwards. And somebody quite wisely thought, these chaps like me who've been up with the fleet, it's time we went and did a short instructor's course at one of these Smith-Barry schools. And I went and did that. And it really was, it made a great difference to my outlook on flying altogether. When I went there, I really thought myself a hell of a pilot, and thought I really could fly. But when I got there, I realized I knew nothing about flying. And there, the Smith-Barry sort of theme was that you make a complete master of your aircraft, and in every attitude and in every situation. And I mean, for example, to break your aircraft in a forced landing was regarded as inexcusable. And that and aerobatics and everything, you were really taught to fly. I really learned to fly there. And I came away a very different person. And also I came away, I think it started there with an interest in aerobatics, not just for themselves, but it was really it sort of gave you confidence and pride in yourself, being able to sort of handle an aeroplane in every attitude. And it did have a remarkable effect. That's one thing that the RNAS inherited from the RFC. It was a marvellous thing for the Air Force, that Smith-Barry system of flying training.
You went on from there to Farnborough, where you continued development flying, and then after all the air experience you had a misfortune again on a motorcycle, didn't you?
Yes.
Which was to have
Well, there was a bit of an interval there. Because of this specialisation, I went on to another carrier, the Argus, and then I went down to Gosport, and I and about 4 other chaps were used for a lot of experimental deck flying, trying out new types of aeroplane on new carriers. And in other words, I was a sort of test pilot, a naval test pilot. Yeah. And then I was posted to the Royal Aircraft Establishment, that famous little RAF section in the RAE. And of course it was a terrific thrill to me, because it had a great reputation, the Farnborough then. And there was I, who knew I had a very narrow outlook on just on the maritime side. And there was I, began one of a team of highly experienced, dedicated, enthusiastic pilots, all expert pilots who'd had experience up and down the Air Force. There were all the aircraft of the Air Force who were who we had in service at that time, all serviceable. Most of the aircraft we had in the war, all serviceable, and a lot of the German aircraft, the last ones in there. And you could, just the sheer love of flying, it was really marvelous, because you could just, when you were not on a particular test with your scientist, you could just ring up and say, get me out the Fokker triplane, and you just go and fly it. Or the little, there were all sorts of things. There was that. And we were a very happy lot, because we worked as civilians. We didn't have the only, restrictions of service life, and we just concentrated on flying. I was extremely happy.
So you must have had, I beg pardon?
Yes. Well, I was just going to come to your point. That was then an accident of luck happened to me. And it was a real accident of luck in my career, but I didn't think so at the time, because it was a motor bicycle accident. And, of course, it took me off flying temporarily and took me away from Palmborough. I thought it was a disaster. And what's worse, I was posted to the Air Ministry.
It wasn't any ordinary Air Ministry, was it, in 1923?
Well,
with the man you were going to work for?
No, I was posted to the Air Ministry in 1923. I forgot the date. And what did I expect of the Air Ministry? Well, I had the ordinary young officer, the pilot's sort of view of the Air Ministry, a sort of polite contempt for the Air Ministry. I didn't know anything about it, didn't know what they did, but I had a general feeling they didn't really understand us, And I'd never been to the Air Ministry or London before. Well, I've been to London, but not to the Air Ministry before. So I went there expecting what I almost call the worst. And what did I find? Well, what I think my first impressions there were was complete surprise. Because there on the 6th floor at the Astral House at the bottom of Kingsley, I went upstairs, and there was a team of pilots, highly experienced, keen pilots, absolutely dedicated to their job, just as dedicated to the needs of the Royal Air Force as the team of pilots I'd left behind at Farnborough. And there they were, led by a most redoubtable personality, with as much control and enthusiasm and direction as any football captain over a football side. And this indomitable personality, Lord Trenchard. We talk of him now as an old man, because he's 104 years old today if he was alive, but he was actually then only 50. And he was, well, as Staff College knows, a quite outstanding man. But we can talk about him in a minute. Mm-hmm. But then I think the other impression I had in coming there was first of all the size of the air staff of that time, and then the quality. Now the size, I'm not making sarcastic remarks about the size of the air staff today, because it's a very highly complex organisation. But up on that 6th floor to the Astral House, and excluding intelligence, a few intelligence officers, and excluding the CAS himself and the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff himself, we had one group captain, 7 squadron leaders, and 1 flight attendant. And the flight attendant was myself. And that was the air staff in 1923. And now the quality. Now, they were all highly experienced officers. They'd served in the front. Portal was one of them. He joined up much the same day as me. He'd spent most of the war on the Western Front. Highly experienced officer. Peter Drummond, who'd got 2 DSOs in the Middle East, and so on. They were all highly experienced in the different service in the service. And they were all qualified pilots. And there it was. And as to their size and their quality. And as I said, and under this dynamic leader, yes, Trenchard. So that was my first impressions on arriving there. Now, what was my job?
Yes, a large part of your responsibility, presumably, was drawing upon your previous fleet experience, and one reflects that this was the time of the very critical years of the naval controversy.
Yes,
the arguments.
I think that's why I was chosen. I was a very ordinary chap, I can tell you, half educated, never had any higher education, but I always had this immense enthusiasm, we all had. Yes. But I was chosen, I think, for 2 reasons. One is that in this very good amalgamation between the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service, they had to show the right sort of apportionment of balance between taking people in that permanent commission list. And therefore, I was an RAF staff. And also, I had this thing, because we've been talking about, I'd had this specialization on fleet aviation and also on all the requirements of the fleet in all these deck landing experiments I've been doing. And so I think I was chosen for that reason, and in particular because at that time was raging this great battle between the Admiralty and the Air Ministry, and the Admiralty wanting back the Royal Naval Air Service, which we can get onto that in a minute.
Yes.
So that was why I went there, I think. And then, of course, my job, if I might just explain that, my job had a dual role. I was primarily the personal assistant to the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, and then I was also doing Air Staff duties, Air Staff work on what you might call maritime policy and operations. That was my role. And I think I'd like to say a word about my boss, Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, a remarkable individual, Sir John Steele, who was, in his way, just as dominant a personality as Trenchard. It's rather a marvel, the way about this amalgamation, how I think it was very well done. They got the right sort of balance between the RNAS and there was an ex-RFC chap, the head of the Air Force, an RNAS man, the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff. And just like Hindenburg and Ludendorff in the war, the one was the complement to the other. Trenchard was the man of this great mission and great ideas, and Steele hadn't got any ideas, but he was a very practical man, and it was his job as Deputy Chief of the Air Force to put Trenchard's decisions into action. And well, he was a remarkable man from my point of view. He was, I think, a lesson to a lot of commanders. He made me, sitting in his outer office there, he made me serve up to him all the papers that he dealt with. I had to bring them in, have them all read up beforehand, have a little note on the top of each saying exactly what they were about and what action I recommended. And I mean, this is a remarkable training for somebody who had no staff training at all. And of course, he was a very severe chap. Everyone was terrified of him. But slowly but surely, I began to do what he wanted and began to lose my fear of him. And that was that. And of course, another thing was that being the PA to the DCS, everyone had to come through my office to see this formidable character, the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff. And they used to say, I used to know them all very well. It was a very small team. And some of them would sound me out to say, sort of, what was he feeling like this morning? Was the economic blockade around the whole of Europe. It was a combination of a political blockade using, because of a lot of neutral countries, to prevent goods and valuable things getting into Germany. And third basis was, of course, which luckily we had provided for, was to strike into the heart of Germany with our strategic air force, our bomber command. And that was the first basis, to hit Germany. We had no other means of hitting her, to hit her there in the middle and contain her. The second phase was, of course, to increase the pressure. As our strength grew, and with the help of American resources, they hadn't come into the war then, it was to use all the material aid they could give us, and to increase the pressure on that great perimeter by the threat of attack, by raids, or possible invasions, so that the Germans would have to expend vast resources around that perimeter to defend it against attack, whether it's in Norway or anywhere else. And again, the strengthening up of the bomber offensive every day, in every way, and to go on pounding away at the military potential of Germany. And the third phase, with everything increasing, the pressure increasing, the bombing increasing, the third phase, and that was a long way away, but it definitely was stated as an aim to the reoccupation or the re-entry into Europe. Mm-hmm. How that would be done, it was too far away to say at the time, but it was definitely in the plans. But first of all, of course, we had to establish a sufficient air superiority, and our bombing had to, so to speak, emasculate, if possible, the backbone of the German military resistance. That, I think, really was the outline of their grand strategy paper. As I said before, it was finally approved and became a government policy.
Yes. The following year, you became Director of Plans for the Royal Air Force. And this wasn't quite as straightforward as it might have seemed, because it was a dual role, wasn't it? In more than one respect,
yes,
in fact.
Of course, my work on this, under Sir John Slessor, who was Director of Plans, on this Strategic Planning Committee, helped me a great deal in taking over this very big burden that he'd been holding. Because in those days, the Director of Plans was upstairs in the Amnesty. He was what was later on called ACS Powell. He was the head of the Directorate of Planning of formation of Air Staff Policy in the Air Staff. And that was his upstairs role, and with all that implies. But downstairs, he had to take that down into the crucible, into the joint planning machine, where with the other two directors of plans, the Director of Naval Plans and the Director of Army Plans, they formed the Joint Planning Committee. And there it had to be fought out. You'd take the Air Staff policy down, and they'd take the other two policies down. You must see each other's point of view. We, of course, were working within the sort of broad concept of the grand strategy paper I've just referred to, and we had the general directions of our chiefs from above. But we did have to hammer out very much the various points of view, and that's where a staff officer in that position has got to learn when perhaps the air staff view he recognised it was too extreme or he went too far, you had to modify the air staff view, and when he had to stand firm and say no, it's absolutely right, and oppose the other's point of view. But in between, we were all brought up in the same sort of school, we understood each other, and it worked. Yes. But it was very, very, very intensive and hard work. And of course, we had the pressure from Churchill above.
Yes, this became a further complication, didn't it?
It was a complication. Yes. Of course, there was, as you know, from the history, that the Prime Minister was taking enormous personal sort of control of everything, or interest in it all. His pressure was continuous on the chiefs of staffs. And those were the lean years, remember, when we hadn't many resources. But the Prime Minister, quite rightly, he was the prodder. He never ever overruled the Chancellor, the chiefs of staffs, on any really vital issue of policy. But it didn't stop him prodding them and trying to make them do things. It made them expose what they had in their bags, so to speak, in the way of shipping and all that. And then one day there was an extraordinary thing happened. A minute, one of those famous minutes from the Prime Minister, action this day, personal for General Ismay for the chiefs of staffs, with effect from Tuesday, whatever it was, the date, the Joint Planning Committee will come directly under the Prime Minister. Well, of course, the chiefs of staffs completely blew up. I mean, this was what you might call a constitutional nonsense. I mean, we were their masters, we can't serve two masters. And they blew up, because General Ismay attended all their meetings. And that's where Pug Ismay, as we used to call him, was a very wise diplomat and wise man generally. And he begged the chiefs of staff to calm down and not get too excited about it. He said the old man is feeling a little bit cut off and all that sort of thing, and he rather likes to feel he would like to have the joint planners immediately control over them, principally because he wants to put some fire in their bellies, and also he wants to see that they're not, got the right ideas. And I assure you it won't do any harm. I mean, they're very wise chap, your directors of plans, and I think it might have been a bit of help, because it helped to brief him and helped to get rid of some of his some more extreme ideas.
You must have had to be very careful, because you could put ideas which you could use against
because we used to go and sit opposite him in a little room there, and he'd be glaring at us across the table and questioning us about this and that. But we knew perfectly well that if we went and talked too much in the wrong direction, he would use anything we said as ammunition to shoot down our very worthy chiefs, the chiefs of staffs, the next time they met at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Yes. So we had to be a bit careful. But nevertheless, it worked very well, like all these things do. We didn't stick too much to the rules, and it worked very well.
There was one particular event, wasn't there, in that sequence, when you went to Washington, I think in December of 1941, Arcadia?
Well, that was, yes.
Where all sorts
suddenly
of
Pearl Harbor happened.
Yes.
And this Anglo-American feeling that the Prime Minister had, he knew his Americans very well, and of course he was terrified that the American nation would all rise up in their wrath to put over their ideas. So in that way, I just want to say that about Sir John Steele. That was his role. Now,
So the critical issue then was the Naval Air Controversy.
well, that, of course, was one of my main preoccupations at the time. There was this great battle going on. Now, again, the Staff College, or anyone interested can go into it. They could read all the cabinet papers there. There was some... The government were worried, the Admiralty were much more powerful than the Air Ministry and the War Office behind, were putting in their plea that the Royal Air Force had been, very useful for the war, but now we must get back to the important things in life, that they must have their Royal Naval Air Service back. And so the government appointed very high committees, the Salisbury Committee, and then a subcommittee, which was the important one, to go into the Admiralty's claims to find out whether they should be approved or not, was called the Balfour Committee. Balfour, a famous minister. Yes. And Sir John Steele and I used to have to go, he used to go and give evidence to this. Trenchard only gave evidence, I think, mostly to the Salisbury Committee, but he did one or two powerful evidences to the Weir Committee, to the Balfour Committee. Mm-hmm. But Sir John Steele was very important in a way. I was important because my voice, I was the only one in the Air Ministry who could really...
The operational experience.
The operational side.
Yes,
I mean, I'd done it and I knew about it and I knew what the Admirals felt. But Sir John Steele was even more important in a way because he was a senior sailor as well as being an airman. He'd come into the RNAS as a senior naval officer and to put a bit of discipline into the certain parts of the RNAS. And so he was talking and impressed the committee as somebody who knew all about the Navy and the fleet, and also as an airman. And we used to, attend these meetings in the Committee of Imperial Defence in Richmond Terrace.
Well, sorry.
Sorry.
No, I was going to just move on slightly from this. I was going to reflect that it's sometimes, I think, very difficult for members of the present generation of the service to understand just, first of all, how deep those issues were, how they really did threaten the very future of the independent Air Force,
yes,
which clearly you were aware of, and certainly
yes,
Lord Trenchard
as I've
was aware
said, you see, the Admiralty had put in their case very strongly, backed up by the naval lobby and everyone else, that they wanted their air service back again.
Yes.
And their argument was, which was a fine one, British sea power, and that they were responsible for the safety of sea communications. England depended on them. We were a great sea power. And really now they couldn't leave it to some other ministry to say what they should have and what the air was going to be very important to them, and they must own everything, right, control everything. Right. In other words, they wanted their own show. Right. And now the Air Ministry case was, of course, partly put over from the top, the principles by Trenchard. But I mean, we all felt it and all expressed it, because we felt that, see, the Admiralty was saying that they didn't agree with the naval case about cooperation. And somebody like me knew that cooperation did work. Yes. After all, I wasn't a proper sailor. The initials RNAS, the sailors used to tease me, the real sailors, it didn't stand for Royal Naval Air Service, it stood for really not a sailor. So, RNAS. So, I was, in a way, although in the war, I was sort of had shown that cooperation did work. Yes. We sort of temporary people could do what the Navy wanted and do it better than even they knew what was wanted. Yes. And not only did Trenchard have the most powerful argument, which were the ones that had led to the formation of the Air Force in the war, and that was that you must harness your resources to develop air power. You couldn't spread them about. If you were a very rich nation, like the Americans later on, you can afford 3 air forces, but we couldn't then. And we were particularly in great contraction of defence money and everything. It was absolutely essential, we're going to develop this thing, that the Air Force should remain one, and cooperation was the way to do it, and not breaking off. And if the Navy got their own Naval Air Service back, they'd want their own training establishments, their own scientific establishments, and so on. And waiting in the wings was the Army Council, and they made it quite clear that if the Navy won their case in the Balfour Committee, then they put in theirs, and that was the end of the Air Force. It really was. It was the most critical, maybe just after the war was critical, but I think it was the most critical few years, or year and a half, in the history of the RAF.
this must have had a very long legacy. I mean, not just generally, because we know that there was an impact on the development of naval aviation. We know that the issues were resurrected some 30, 40 years later. But this must have had a strong personal impact on you, because you must have seen then the need to coordinate and to cooperate, and the problems didn't happen.
People like Sir John Steele and I, we sympathised with the Navy. We knew that the fine show and all that, but we knew there wasn't the money and the resources. We knew that we were better able, perhaps, to develop the Air Force to help them and the Army. And being sailors or ex-sailors, we felt very strongly about it. And my experience with the last time, in the end of the war, had shown, as I said before, that the senior sailors, I used to get very irritated with some of their saying what they wanted. It showed they didn't know what they wanted.
Yes.
And
sorry.
Yes.
I was going to say, before we leave that period, would you care to give us your own personal recollections of Trenchard? How he impressed you in day-to-day working when you saw him regularly? What sort of image did he project? How did you regard him?
Yes, well, of course, I'm not giving you the impressions we all have of Trenchard in retrospect. My impressions there as a young 25-year-old flight lieutenant, well, I've already told you, he was a dominating personality over this small team and this sixth-floor Dastrel house. I mean, his personality came through all the doors and all the windows. You could almost hear him in your office. And, of course, I knew him very well from the beginning because being PA to the DCS, he used to come striding through my bosses, my office, to get to and talk to the DCS. So I knew him from the beginning. And then, of course, he used to send for me a lot in the middle of all these committee meetings and things, because so I had this Trenchard, see that although he was been a pilot himself and he knew the sort of strategy of this argument, and he was absolutely right about it, he didn't know very much about fleet aviation. And when the Admiralty or the admirals were producing little arguments and he wanted to shoot them down, and his way of shooting them might not be quite right. And so with the enthusiasm of a young pilot and who had very strong feelings on the matter, I found myself standing up to this formidable chief of the air staff and, arguing, very hotly with him and just to put him right on that. And he liked that. Trenchard was a man like Churchill. He had to be stood up to. He was full of ideas all the time, and not all of them were practical. And he relied on his staff to argue with him, and of course every now and then he'd steamroll over you and tell you we're talking nonsense and absolutely flatten you. But you didn't mind, because he did it in a way somehow you didn't mind, because you knew he was trying to get the right answer. Yes. But that way, then he made me his ADC for about, I think, a couple of months it was, because he was missing one, and I used to go around with him to RAF stations. And so I did, he left an enormous impression on everyone who worked under him, and particularly one on me. And Mark, we had people like Portal that I've mentioned before, Mackey and Co. there, and then he trusted his staff very well, but they had to stand up to him, but they used to pick up his ideas and take away and think them out and develop them, if or come back again on them.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
I don't know if there's anything else. There's so much one could say about him. But
no, what I'd like to do now, if I may, sir, is to move on a little, because from the Air Ministry in 1926, you left to join 56 Squadron at Biggin Hill.
Yeah.
And I'd like to come back in a later context to the thoughts of the fighter world and the air defence world. But there's just one, well, there were several, but there's one particularly significant event in 1927, when I think while you were still with 56, wasn't that the occasion when the parachute was first issued to the Royal Air Force?
Yes. May I just put in, just before that, is I was posted from the Air Ministry to 56 Squadron. I'd just like to say that I left the Air Ministry as a very different man to what I arrived. I came away from what I've just said to you, I mean, just like all of us did, as rather like a disciple with the gospel to live up to. You didn't say that sort of thing, but you felt everything that you'd experienced in the Air Ministry. And don't forget to see, at the Air Ministry, I've talked all about the naval side, but being PA to DCAS, I'd seen the Air Force as a whole. I'd seen what Trenchard was trying to do to show what the Air Force could do in the Middle East and in India, I had this much wider view of the Air Force. And before, as I said, my ideas of the Air Ministry were, you know, just the ordinary pilot's ideas. And I came away with a very different idea. Here were a team of chaps who were all pilots. Mark, at the Air Ministry, one used to go and fly. We all used to keep ourselves in flying. Actually, when I was at the Air Ministry, I actually was sent down to do some deck landing trials of a new type of, on a carrier. But in other words, there I had this very different impressions of the Air Ministry. When I arrived in 56 Squadron, of course, they thought, here comes one of these Air Ministry types. I was very thrilled to go to 56 Squadron because it was perhaps the most famous squadron of a lot of famous squadrons on the Western Front of the war. It had all these famous aces who had been served in it. It had a very enormous record. And I think the lesson of that is that I was immensely impressed with what squadron tradition. We knew all about it in the army, that sort of thing, but it had an immense impression, perhaps in 56 Squadron. We weren't any better, or they weren't any better than the chaps in the other squadrons, but they all felt they had to live up to the record of 56. And there were a lot of sort of competition, inter-squadron competitions those days. So that was a big impression. And then another thing was, of course, we all, I was back on the flying. I don't want to emphasize this, but flying in those days, and I'm sure it is now, was a great delight, a great enthusiasm. Everyone wanted to fly, and it was you were back in your own flying world. We had different aeroplanes, so we had Grebes to start with, and then Siskins, and I wanted to show my skill in aerobatics at Farnborough. And these aerobatics that I talked about, they aren't just a sort of show-off. It's a sort of rather like medieval times when you had to show your skill at arms. It was a way of showing your confidence in yourself, your confidence and what the aeroplane could do. Well then, and so my time there was exciting. I think I ought to say for once that 56 Squadron was at Biggin Hill. It was in a thing called Fighting Area, which was Duxbridge. And I can't pretend that we really contributed a great deal to air defence of the United Kingdom because we had no blind flying instruments. We had, there was no system of control or direction except by telephone. We were all, I think, it was a very efficient and competent fighter squadron. But at that time, and of course the needs for the things like I mentioned pretty stood out in our minds. And you mentioned the having parachute. Well, that was, for some reason I can't remember, the Air Force wasn't issued with parachutes. They'd had them for balloons before, but until this about, where are we? About 1926, 27. And then one morning I was acting commanding officer at Biggin Hill. My squadron command was away, and the door opened, and in came Flight Lieutenant Grace from Henlow. And we knew each other, and he said, well, I said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I've just brought the Vickers Vimy. I said, why are you here? Well, I said, I'm here to let you and Kenley next door to do, if you want to volunteer to jump from the Vimy in the new Irving parachute. And my heart rather went in my boots. And he said, I've just come from Duxford, and he said we had a very successful time, that every pilot jumped, and the station commander was the first off. And as I was the first off, it was a cold and frosty morning about a week later, and frost on the ground, and we took off in this Vimy, and I had to be the first off on the starboard wing, and on the port wing was our newly arrived pilot officer, straight from Cranmore, who happened to be a chap called Thomas Pike, who ultimately became Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Thomas Pike today, sometime after me. And we went off and we did our first pull-offs, and then we did a jump. But that, having done that, and then it made all the difference in the world, and sitting on your Irving parachute in a cockpit thereafter, to your confidence as a pilot. It really did.
But to me, sir, you've skipped over a very important little bit there. You casually mentioned you were on the wing. Could you describe how you actually made the jump from this
Yes,
Vimy?
but in a way of sort of letting the Air Force, the pilots, get not indoctrinated, it's not the word, my vocabulary's got rather to the parachute. They first had what was called pull-offs.
Yes.
In other words, what you did, there was a little platform on the outer strut, at the foot of the outer strut on each wing, a little platform there, and you went up, you took off, the Vimy took off, and you were facing astern. Your stomach was up against the front of the strut.
You're actually sitting on the wing?
No, standing on,
standing
with your hands around the strut.
holding the strut.
And then when the aircraft got up to the right height for pull-offs, it was only about 1,500 feet, and he would do a run-up towards this circle of the airfield. Yes. He would then wave you, give a signal to you, and you'd edge your way around that little platform, hang on to the strut, because the airspeed wasn't much more to 80 or 90 knots or something, and hang on with all your worth to the strut, and put your hand on the ripcord. And then when he gave you the signal to pull, you pulled. Now, if the parachute didn't open, you've still got your hand on the strut. and so that was why it was called a pull-off. When you've done that and got used to it, you did a jump through the bottom of the fuselage, and you did an ordinary jump and a delayed jump and pulled the ripcord.
Right, thank you, sir. Well, now, time is getting on now towards lunch, and we've still got quite a lot of ground to cover. If I could just make sure my own sequence is correct. From 1929, you went out to the Northwest Frontier after attending Staff College.
Yes.
And there you had, again, you pursued this joint career, which was already emerging as a staff, broad vision, followed by actual operation experience.
Yes.
And among the many experiences which you had on the Northwest Frontier, when you were participating in the air control program, you met, I think, General Slim for the first time, didn't you?
Yes. I don't know how much time we've got. Have I time just to mention what happened on the frontier at Cohart?
Yes, indeed. I think perhaps this would be a good point to finish off with, sir, just before lunch, if we could do that.
Yes. Well, I went out to India, and the first thing to say about that is that I had never been to India before, abroad before, and of course I hadn't been there very long before I was quite amazed. I expected to find things all rather slow and out of touch. How amazed how alive the Air Force was there. It was a very small Air Force. We only had 4 bomber squadrons on the frontier and 1 Army Cooperation Squadron, but it was run on a shoestring. They hadn't much money, but it was very well organized, well trained, and they were all very much alive. Our job on the frontier was support the army, which, as you know, I can't give you a lecture on India in those days, but there was the tribal territory, and there was the administered frontier, and the army's job was to keep the tribes in order if they misbehave or raided into administered territory. And then we'd invented it, been thought of by Lord Trenchard and other things, and applied in Iraq, and that was using the Air Force as a form of control with political officers, as opposed to sending in a column of the army. Sending in a column of the army meant really a sort of war. And it was playing the Pathan at his own game, because he loved that. He was a guerrilla fighter, and he was up in the hills, and he could snipe and all that. And it was fighting, which he understood, and they're very good with rifles and things. But the army was to go in and fight all men, and a lot of casualties on both sides. It disturbed the whole frontier. A lot of the rest of the tribes would come in and support the bad tribe. And it created commotion. And then it wasn't very humane, because the army then had to burn the villages and drive a lesson home. But air control was, again, the Pathan regarded as very unsporting, because he couldn't retaliate. It was under the control of the political officer. There were never any casualties, or very few. There shouldn't be any. And it was a sort of blockade. You said, you'll be naughty boys, you pay up a fine, this, that, and the other. It didn't excite the other tribes. They couldn't retaliate, and they got bored with being sort of bitten by fleas in their caves. They paid their fine, and they went back. And that was air control. And we were on the frontier. I was there for a year. And it was a marvellous thing. We were also supporting garrisons far north of Chitral and all over Waziristan down to Quetta. We were flying everywhere, and it was, I could tell you a long story about it. It was very exciting. And then I was posted to headquarters, India, RAF India, Delhi, Simla, the capital, and came under that remarkable man who was at AOC&C, Air Marshal Sir Geoffrey Salmon, who had been been a pioneer of developing sort of air control and all those sort of things in the Middle East, in Iraq and everywhere. And there he was, and there I came to this Air Ministry, this headquarters, to find just what I had found in the Air Ministry in Whitehall, a very keen, dedicated team of young chaps, all pilots, and under the leadership much the same as Trenchard. And our main mission there, of course, was first of all to keep the Air Force going, to develop everything that the Air Force could do, as we saw in the future, particularly to keep on pressing these ideas of air control. And we were always backed up by, as I say, from the the Foreign Office, it was called the Foreign and Political Department. And then to develop our air routes, we hadn't got the air route to Singapore properly going yet, and so on. And over you mentioned Field Marshal Slim. Well, actually, in those days, he was Major Slim, and he was my opposite number in the General Staff. I was a squadron leader on the air staff. We were great personal friends. Our wives were too. We played tennis together. But we used to have awful arguments in the club and elsewhere about this air control. And I remember him jokingly teasing me and saying that he regarded, and the Commander-in-Chief regarded, as the Air Force as being a greater menace to India than the Russians. And he went on to develop his argument was the Russians were a long way away, the other side of the Hindu Kush, and the army was there, and as long as the army was there, the Russians hadn't got a hope. But here along came the Air Force with their ideas about air control, and they appealed to the Treasury people, the foreign political people, and before you know what happened, the army would be cut down and decimated from within by the Air Force arguments. But that was a sort of joke, right?
Yes, yes,
yes. But you mentioned it. Then, of course, while we were there, I flew Sir Geoffrey all over India. We had frequent visits to the frontier. I took him down on this pioneering flight to Singapore. We went down with an Hyundai transport aircraft and another Wapiti. We called in on the King of Siam on the way, where we had a week's celebrations, because they'd invited us, he'd invited the Viceroy to send us. And we came to Singapore. We developed that route, and that was open. Sir Geoffrey Salmon, I just mentioned this for the record, he was the man, because I just arrived in India after the end of the Cornwall airlift. Now, the staff coach may not have heard about the Cornwall airlift, but it was the first major airlift in history. Yes. There was he, sitting in Delhi, and there in Cornwall was our ambassador, and I forget the number, call it 1,500 British civilians, and suddenly there was a revolution, and they were all beleaguered in the embassy, and it got worse and worse. And Geoffrey Salmon got on to his brother, John Salmon, who was the CS, and said, now, why don't we show what the Air Force can do and lift the lot out? And so a lot of signalling, that sort of thing. They got the bomber transports from Iraq. They were flown hurriedly to the northwest frontier, and they, with the bomber squadrons on the northwest frontier, lifted the whole lot out, including the ambassador, was the last to come out. And they were still talking about it when I was there, and that was due to Sir Geoffrey Salmon. It's an illustration of how in those days we were trying to think of ways of showing what air power could develop.
Well, I think, sir, that's a very appropriate point to finish, because, as you say, you are still thinking of the ways in which air power can be applied. And you're going to return to the UK, you're going to prepare for World War II, and I think perhaps if we could pick up the story after lunch of your preparation for World War II and your employment thereafter, I think we'll see how the career begins to expand at that point.
It's a very good idea.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you returned, sir, from India in 1934 to take command of 25 Squadron, a further tour of duty as an operational pilot and squadron commander. You then went to Staff College as a member of the directing staff, and from there you went to the Imperial Defence College, now of course RCDS. So I suppose in many respects your career up to 1939, like many other members of your generation, had been giving you a very, very balanced preparation for your tasks which were to lie ahead. And as I understand it, in 1939, your first wartime appointment was to be as a member of the newly formed Strategic Planning Section of the Joint Planning Staff, where you went with a sailor and a soldier colleague from NDC, from the Imperial College. And you were given one or two additional specific tasks in that period, such as discussions with the French on the Norwegian campaign. But I was particularly intrigued to note that a major task immediately after Dunkirk was to formulate a grand strategy paper. And it occurred to me at that time that you might have reflected on more than one occasion about a comment you made on a saying by Lord Trenchard about the role of the pilot as a staff officer. What was that?
Yes, I should have told you about that when I was telling you about my time at the Air Ministry in 23, 26, because I remember somebody at that time, I can't remember who it was, saying to Lord, as Hugh Trenchard, saying, oh, sir, why can't we have staff pay like the War Office? And Sir Hugh absolutely turned on him like a lion and tore him to shreds, and he said, certainly not. He said, we're all the same. Staff officers are no better than pilots. We're just, when we're staff officers, we're just pilots flying in another capacity. Just remember that. And that has been, I think, the spirit in the Air Force ever since.
Yes.
A general duties officer is preeminently a pilot, and he takes that feeling back to command, into the staff, and so on.
So there you were then in the spring of 1940, when the whole of the world expected Britain to surrender, and yet you were being directed to prepare a strategy to win the war.
Yes.
Would you?
Well, as you say, we came straight from the IDC. The IDC closed down in the middle of '39 because the crisis was imminent, and we were doing really the job which were training for in syndicate, to do it in real life. We formed this new section of the Joint Planning Staff called the Strategic Planning Section. I was immediately under the Directors of Plans, and our job was to produce strategic papers for the Directors of Plans for the Chiefs of Staff. And what you've said about, we had various other jobs to do, but then we had this big job, producing a grand strategy paper. Now this happened, I think, as you said, it was quite remarkable, but it reflected the whole spirit of the country from Churchill downwards. I mean, there was no question of defeat, and after Dunkirk it was a humiliation in a way, but it really, it's happened so many times in British history, it just roused everyone. And there's an illustration that before Dunkirk was over, we were sitting down under the orders of Chiefs of Staff to produce out a grand strategy paper. Now, this grand strategy paper was no more than you know all about at the Staff College. It was a very big and comprehensive appreciation of the situation. It didn't only evaluate military factors, it evaluated economic factors. We had economic advisors in to help us. We had a Foreign Office chap in to help us. And there we produced the bones of the paper. Of course, later on it was polished by the Directors of Plans, amended by the Chiefs of Staffs, and before it was finally approved. But I can't remember all the details. It was quite a big document. It had a lot of appendices. But I do remember the main outline of that grand strategic plan, which incidentally, when it was approved, became the basis of really British grand strategy, and copies were sent to the Americans, and it became the basis of Anglo-American grand strategy, and the American fitted in very well with that. The outline was broadly this. It was really, I would put it in, as far as I can remember, in 3 phases. The first phase was a policy of containment. There were the Germans, almighty on land, but they had an enormous perimeter from northern Norway, stretching right round the coast of France, right down the southern Mediterranean, almost to Greece, and well, later on Greece came into it. So it was an enormous perimeter, and it was our first aim in this plan was to contain them within that perimeter, to make certain they didn't break out and seize positions of great strategic importance which might have a decisive effect on our victory in the war. And the second thing, to contain them inside their perimeter, to prevent them getting additional economic resources which they hadn't got within Europe. And this plan, of course, was accompanied by the full use of our sea power to impose and tear up all the plans which had been agreed between us and under Roosevelt in the eventuality when the Americans would come in, and that they would hurl themselves on the Japanese, forgetting altogether that it was vital to put Hitler first, defeat Hitler first, and deal with the Pacific afterwards. And so we were all bundled into a battleship, the 3 Chiefs of Staffs and the 3 Directors of Plans, that's us, and 1 or 2 experts, and we threw in Lord Beaverbrook as well, and we all rushed across the Atlantic. And when we got there, Winston's fears were really, not say groundless, but they weren't, and Roosevelt got everything under control. But our arrival there did make a great impression on me, because we were, there it was, the Prime Minister, the Chiefs of Staffs, the 3 Directors of Plans, with a very magnificent Secretariat, arriving as a very compact little body, a united team, knowing what they wanted, and it had a very big impact on the Americans, who, as you can imagine, they were in a great commotion everywhere. Yes. Yeah. The Navy wanted to do this, the Army wanted to do that, and Roosevelt was trying to control it all. But our arrival had a marvellous effect, because the Prime Minister went to live with the President in the White House, and those 2 got on together like a house on fire. They were in one accord, and they agreed there that they should sit there and generally sort of think out the main sort of political strategy, and that there are two lots of chiefs of staff should be down below and meet together and should submit answers to various questions.
And in fact, was this not the period when, was it Brigadier Jacob or Brigadier Hollis demonstrated a very important piece of staff work?
Yes, I never forget the first meeting, you see, that a directive came down from the White House that the Joint Chiefs, combined chiefs, would meet together and produce answers to 4 or 5 questions. And that first meeting, we were in attendance sitting at the side of the room there, and there were the 4 American chiefs of staffs and our 3, and they very luckily for us, or for them too, we put our chairman, Admiral of the Fleet, Pound, into the chair for this joint meeting. But of course, the moment we started to discuss the first item, the Americans all started arguing amongst each other, all differing with each other as to what should be done, and the thing became a bit chaotic. And then our chairman did a very wise thing. He said, well, gentlemen, that's a very interesting discussion. I think we more or less got the bones of it. May I suggest that our secretary here, Brigadier Jacob, who later became General Sir Ian Jacob, he goes away and drafts out something for us to put up to the White House, which is what we've all more or less agreed, and then while we get on to item 2. And there it was, a marvellous example of good staff work. Ian Jacob was a very well-trained staff officer. He slipped out, and in the twinkling of an eye, he came back with one of those immaculate bits of paper, a little draft which said all the things that they should have said and wanted to say really, and put things in their right priority. And it was passed around, copies of it, and they all grunted and looked at it, and they agreed it. And then there was another secretary there, Brigadier Hollis, and that happened in the rest of the meeting. And that was just the first meeting. But slowly and surely, it began to work. The whole machine began to work. The Americans sort of began to try and model themselves on this system. They appointed secretaries for themselves. And it really, and they proved what became in the war the combined chiefs of staff system. That was the Americans' house, which was supposed to run the Allied strategy. And that's it, sealed it. Yes. But of course, it wasn't quite the same down on our level. We were meeting in exactly the same way. It was laid down that we should meet their directors of plans. And so there we were sitting at a table, the little 3 musketeers, us, Navy, Army, and Air Force, with our little secretary. And on the opposite side of the table were about 15 or 20 American generals and brigadiers. Half of them were sailors, and the other half were soldiers, and they all had different views on everything. But luckily we'd come wisely with a certain prepared papers, and it was a pretty good dogfight, but in the end it sort of worked. Yes. And I do remember, it just doesn't really help history, but one of the chaps on the opposite side was an Army brigadier who was particularly helpful in drafting. He was helping us. He was helping to sort of get some order out of this dogfight, and getting out, say, a draft directive for our Supreme Commander, Southeast Asia. And his name was Brigadier Dwight Eisenhower. But I didn't know he was going to be the general later on, but he just stuck out in my memory that time. Well, thank goodness here's a good staff officer. Yes. And that began to work.
Well, thank you, sir. We move on then from Arcadia and your period as Director of Planning, and you spend the better part of 2 years commanding 4 different groups, in fact. Now, I make this point because I know your views on this, that the story of those 4 groups has been told often, but I think it's very important to indicate how balanced your own career was, to show that for a fair part of the war you were in very thorough command. But then, near the end of the war, you return again to London, this time in the relatively new appointment, following, I think, soon after Sir John Slessor as ACS Pol, before becoming Vice Chief. And much as I would like to spend time on ACAS Pol as well, I think perhaps the Vice Chief period is rather more important. This is the period when you observe the change of the Russian ally into a potential enemy, and you have another view of jointery, don't you? Because you start to work at that time for a new Chief of Air Staff in Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir Arthur Tedder, Lord Tedder. Would you care to reflect on that particular period? Because I know you have some views on the jointery and the combined operations.
Well, as you say, I was Assistant Chief of the Air Staff Policy, and then I was suddenly made Vice Chief of the Air Staff. Well, that sounds a terrific thing. As additional member of our council, it sounds like a terrific promotion. But I must say it seemed quite a natural thing for me at that time, because I was just down the corridor. I moved into the VSS's office, which had a communicating door with the Chief of the Air Staff, Lord Trenchard. And I think, like a lot of these appointments, I didn't feel it was promotion. I felt it was rather a sensible thing. Perhaps it was presumptuous, because I did know, I knew more about the Chiefs of Staff's machine than anyone happened at that time to be at the Air Ministry, including Lord Trenchard, who hadn't been on the Chiefs of Staffs before. And I knew the ACS policy, the Air Staff sort of workings. So I went into that chair with a good deal of confidence. And as well, yes, I think I had a point there which I'd forgotten. Doesn't matter. I'll come back to it. Well, working under Lord Trenchard, of course, was a great pleasure. Very easy. He was. And that's the funny thing between the wars. There was very little that separated us in rank. I mean, Portal was a squadron leader, and I was a flight lieutenant in the early days. And in between the wars, I mean, Trenchard was a wing commander, and I was a squadron leader, and it was very good. But now he'd become a great man. Everyone enormously admired, including myself, his handling of the air power in North Africa and the Middle East in the most classic way. And then his experience, as you know, and with Eisenhower and in Northern Europe. He was a very great man, and a very balanced man. And working under him was really a pleasure. Working with him was very different to Portal. Now, Trenchard was a Portal. I just deal with him for a moment. Now, he was just the man almost sent by destiny to be Chief of the Air Staff during the war. He was a very great man. He was just a man. But working with Churchill, we had to be a very self-contained man. Big people in industry weren't much good working with Churchill in the war. They never knew the facts. They usually got those from people down below. But you had to, with working with Churchill, you had to have the answer absolutely straight away off the tip of your tongue. So Portal was a very self-contained man. He used all of us who were working with him not so much to tell him what to do as to give him the facts so that he could decide what to do and he could argue with the Prime Minister. Now, of course, Trenchard was very different. Trenchard was a great decentralizer. If you go into his office, you would probably find him puffing his pipe with his feet on the blotting paper, and you'd say to him, so what do you want to do about this or that? And he'd give you a twinkle in the eye, and he'd say to you, what do you think you're paid for? You go and tell me. And that was a very good thing, really, because he's always there to back you up if anything went wrong or take control if anything went wrong. But it made the whole staff feel, from me downwards, that the weight of responsibility to do the things was on me. And when a commander or a Chief of Air Staff can do that, he's got a great priceless asset. Portal had to do it in the war, but if you really leave everything to do yourself, you'll find underneath, and you've got a lot of yes men underneath you, you'll find you're sitting on a very small base.
Yes.
Well, that was one of the impressions of Trenchard. He's a magnificent chap to work with.
Now, there was another man there, though, sir, that didn't create quite the same impression, wasn't there? What about your views on General Montgomery, or Field Marshal Montgomery, in that environment?
Field Marshal Montgomery, I mean, he is another great man, but he's a great army commander in the field. But I've got to say it, I mean, it isn't what I say, it's what John Cunningham, who was the first Sea Lord, or anyone else had said at the time. He was a disaster on the Chief of Staff's Committee. He didn't believe in committees, he didn't believe in the Chief of Staff's Committee. He determined he wasn't going to work it, like it had been worked through the war. He was, I say again, a very great man, but he was a great egoist in a way. And his view was that I sit back in the War Office and I send my Vice Chief. He will do what I say at the Chief of Staff's Committee. It doesn't work like that. And I used to go and represent Trenchard, who was often on tour at that time, on the Chief of Staff's Committee, and John Cunningham was in the chair, and myself, and Monty would arrive. And his sort of attitude was to slap a paper on the table, item 2 of the agenda, and saying, well, gentlemen, we come to item 2, those are my views. I put them in this paper, you probably read it, those are my views. And nothing you say or anyone else will say will make me change them. Those are my views. I respect your opinions, I'm sure they're very good opinions. But if you don't agree with my opinions, well, put your views up to the Minister, and he can look at my views and your views, and he can decide. Well, of course, the Chief of Staff doesn't work that way, and particularly at that time, bless his heart, we had a very nice sort of Minister of Defence, First Lord. He used to be First Lord of the Admiralty, Alexander, but he wasn't a great man of decision. And he wasn't feeling very secure in his job, and of course he was in no position to sort of adjudicate between Monty. So it is a lesson to anyone, and everyone will agree that although Monty was a very great man, he was a model of what you should not be as a chief of staff or head of your service on the chief of staff's committee.
Yes, yes.
I just mentioned that, and I hope it won't be taken as any denigration of him as a military leader.
Well, it's the converse, isn't it? It's really of what you've been saying hitherto, stressing the importance of jointery at all the levels that we have done.
Yeah. And of course, I would say there was, as well known, a big, strong antipathy between Cheddar and Montgomery. Cheddar couldn't bear Montgomery. It wasn't the other way around. I don't think Cheddar cared very much. And that didn't sort of help. But I mean,
Cheddar couldn't bear Montgomery.
No, it was the other way around.
Montgomery couldn't bear.
He couldn't.
Really?
Disapproved of Cheddar.
Really?
And Cheddar, as you know, had to fight him a good deal.
Yes.
When he was deputy to Eisenhower, and Monty was commanding our Northern Army Group.
Yes.
And there was a long story like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, Montgomery had a very strong dislike of Cheddar afterwards. But that's.
Yes,
but that I'm sure that wasn't the main reason. His belief that he didn't believe in the committee system. Well, that was nonsense because the cabinet's a committee, and Whitehall has to work by committees.
Well, by this time then, sir, you're very fully aware of the interaction of military affairs and political policy. But I think if you hadn't been, your next appointment would have made it very, very clear, because you then went to be Commander-in-Chief, Middle East Air Force. And this is a period which has not been examined very thoroughly in Royal Air Force history, but it does include one incident which I think is unique, and that is when we actually fought the Israeli Air Force with what could have been very disturbing international implications, and you were caught in the middle of this, weren't you?
Yeah,
would you care to comment on that?
And again, it's very difficult in these short interviews to embark on perhaps on one subject like the Middle East at that time. It was, I think I've just got to say, it was of course a huge command.
Yes. Yes.
Just in size, it stretched, it included Malta, right through the Mediterranean. We had a mission in Greece, it included Cyprus. Our mandate in Palestine, we had forces there. It stretched all the way to the east through Iraq, where we had forces there, right over to Pakistan, where we were sort of helping them form their air force, that sort of thing. And it went all the way down through Aden and into Kenya and Khartoum, Africa. It was an enormous command. And that is one thing about it. It had to be run. It couldn't be run independently. It had, I think, 10 sub-commands and an enormous number of stations and staging posts. Now, from the point of view of the CNC, the area CNC's responsibility, that was me, and I exerted command in the ordinary way, that is over administration, personnel. We were responsible for all the supply services, all the technical services with our depots in the Canal Zone in Egypt, in the ordinary way. But of course I couldn't command it operationally like you could with an ordinary operational command, because each one of those, or most of those, were under the political control of the local political authority. And therefore the AOC, the local AOC of those 10 AOCs had to be given delegated responsibility to run their day-to-day operations. My job as AOC and C and representing the CAS was to make sure the Air Force was being used properly in all those areas, properly in a way, and to intervene to help the AOC if he was having trouble with his political authority, or to help the political authority in various ways. Yes. And therefore one had to have constant visiting and very much keeping in touch.
But there was the exception, wasn't there, when you did take direct control?
Well, I just come to that, we've got to say. I don't know how much longer we've got. But just to give it out, I mean, just remember what was happening in Palestine. We were responsible for the mandate there. Well, that had a special thing, the internal security and defence of the frontiers. And then little Jordan, I would like to mention the little King Hussein. You see, there he's always been very pro-Air Force and very pro-British, because it was number 14 Squadron in the early days when he started his kingdom there, that saved him from the Wahhabis, which really were the Saudis, who came to advance on Amman and drive him out of Jordan. And little 14 Squadron sort of got busy with their aircraft and they routed them. He'd always been very pro. So we kept 14 Squadron there, and we were supporting his defence, and visits to him were always, rather good value. He used to have you to dinner and talk and talk and talk. And then again, same in Iraq. We had the little king was young with the regent of Iraq, and the famous old man, the Prime Minister Nuri Said Pasha, who was the Prime Minister, I've been many times at, and we had this enormous base at Habaniyar, and there we were supporting that kingdom. But of course that had to be handled with kid gloves between the ambassador. And then, of course, we had this very special responsibility which we had for many years before, and that is the air control of the Aden Protectorate under the Resident of Dayton. And so all those things, the AOC had to, keeping in very close touch with the CAS, it was of immense interest and bench spelt. Now you're coming to where the AOC and CAS does intervene. Now this was, I've forgotten the dates now, but I think it was the very beginning of 49, wasn't it?
Yes, the end of 48.
The end of 49. Well, suddenly, out of the blue, the Israelis launched an incursion into Sinai. Nobody locally knew, the government at home didn't know, it just happened. Now the story is briefly as this. The British government, Her Majesty's government, was in a very difficult position, because here was the Israelis looking as if they were going to advance right across Sinai. We were occupying the canal zone. We had an agreement with Egypt, and therefore, in other words, we had a moral, if not a political, obligation to defend Egypt. But there we were between the Egyptians in a way, except their army was in Sinai, and the Israelis. And the last thing HMG wanted to do was to get into war with the Israelis. We just handed over the mandate and all that. And so we did all our pressure on Tel Aviv to stop them, but it was no good. So then we appealed to the Americans, very strongly indeed, and they had even more control over the Israelis, who were very dependent on American money at that time, to stop the Israelis at all costs. And the Americans, for some reason, which I've forgotten, were reluctant. And they said, anyway, it hasn't happened. They haven't crossed this frontier across this sandy desert. And we said they had. And so suddenly I got a telegram as Commander-in-Chief, straight from, I forget who it was from, it was either from the Foreign Secretary or from the CAS, but I think it was simply saying that I had to produce photographic evidence at once to prove that the Israelis were on the making an attack and were across a certain line, a geography in Sinai. But very strict political instructions. On no account was I to be engaged with hostility with the Israeli Air Force. And therefore I had to get these photographs almost without having any ammunition in the guns. Well, this was not a thing I could delegate to an AOC. It was a very personal sort of order. It was not the sort of air operation that the Air Force is normally asked to do. And so I took personal control myself and in daily touch with the CAS. And we sent our reconnaissance Spitfires over, but the Israeli Air Force contained a number of very good pilots. Some of them, I believe, were in the Battle of Britain. And although we tried evasive action, they succeeded in shooting down 2 Spitfires on that particular day. And then again, in frantic signals with the CAS, but we hadn't got the photographs. We got, well, 2, we hadn't got enough. So then I sent up some more reconnaissance Spitfires to get the photographs, and then covered them with I think they were Typhoons we had then, with a wing of Typhoons. But again, with strict orders, no combat. Well, then the Israelis somehow got through, and 2 more aircraft got shut down. But we got the photographs. They were sent to Washington, and in due course the Americans were persuaded. In other words, it succeeded, and the Israelis in due course withdraw. But of course it started an enormous row in the House of Commons. And the opposition, as like oppositions always do, was saying that we have government mishandling of the thing, when the one man they wanted head on the charger was Dickson, you see, stupid handling of his Air Force. And that's where I must take my hat off to the little Prime Minister, Attlee, at the time, because when all this sort of shouting had stopped, he got up slowly to the front bench there in the House of Commons and said that the Commander-in-Chief, the AOC, CNC in the Middle East, had acted entirely under his instructions and did exactly what he'd told him, and he accepted full responsibility for everything that happened. And which, bravo the politician for once in a way. And, well, that's the end of that story. But it is, I think, a terrific, well, as it proved in Suez afterwards, that the terrifically close link there has to be these days between military action and political action. The ones react on the other so terribly sort of...
Yes, well, we'll come on to Suez in a moment, if we may, but just before we do that, if we could just look at the intervening period, because in 1950 you come back again to the Ministry of Defence, you do a tour as AMSO in a very challenging time, because it's the period of the build-up in the aftermath of the Berlin airlift, the period of the build-up during Korea, and I'm sure that knowing a little bit about Sir John Slessor, he was asking for an awful lot while you were trying to point out what the restraints were.
When I was AMSO?
Yes, when you were AMSO.
Well, we must get very shortly. Well, that's quite true. But taking over AMSO is not like taking over the Middle East. It's a huge sort of field. Yes. But I was a GD officer taking over. But as you know, a GD officer taking over AMSO, and it applies today, I'm sure, cannot know about, or even after he's finished, know about the technique of all the technical services and the supply services and the works. So we had responsible for all works in those days. We had our own works department. But what he can do is he's wide and experienced chap at that time. He knows how they all fit in and what they should do. And his job is to coordinate them and see that they fulfill their policy economically in accordance with the wishes of the Air Council. But, as you say, he's got to be in very close touch with the air staff. And I used to joke when I was there is that the job of AMSO is to keep at least one move ahead of the air staff. And that very much applied at that time because, you see, we'd been in a time of great contraction, which you, I think, just mentioned. And then suddenly Korea blew up. We had the war in Korea, and then we had the Berlin airlift, the great commotion, and there was a fear of another world war, and we must strengthen everything. And there was all the buttons were being pressed that we had to expand. From going down, we had the other way. Right. Well, now the AMSO, with his knowledge of the air staff, had to be jolly careful that he didn't obey their commands too fully, because we'd expanded inefficiently. So we had to be... There's not much lessons in that. And the other big thing that happened to me in the AMSO was, as again a result of the Berlin airlift, Truman, the president, and actually the Prime Minister agreed that we must strengthen the deterrent against Russia. We couldn't have another one of these blockades at Berlin. And we must re-establish the American Air Force in the United Kingdom. And so I was set up with American General Johnson to establish 6 big Strategic Air Command bomber bases in this country. And that's the history of the beginning of that. And we got out a thing called the Johnson-Dixon Agreement, which was a very good bargain from the Americans' point of view, because they didn't, like in Spain and everything else, they had to pay a lot of money for this. It was all free, but we provided the land, they did the work. Anyway, that was that. Then I went on to CAS after that.
Yes, that, obviously, it's very seldom one has a chance to put this kind of question, sir, but when you went into that office for the first time, at the height of your profession, what were your thoughts when you became CAS?
On becoming CAS, going up those steps of stairs to the CAS's office. Well, thinking quickly, I think that what I felt was very much the same as I think it was 16 predecessors had felt after Trenchard, becoming CS. You felt really you had a sort of torch. I don't know whether that's the right expression. You felt you had a sort of torch which you had to carry on. It was the Trenchard sort of concepts of air power. You had that. You also had a terrific sense of what everyone expected of you. You wanted to live up to that, to being CAS. You had a feeling again that, don't forget, this was coronation year, a rather particular year. So you had this terrific feeling that you must do your job properly. But you did have a feeling which I think is unique in the services, that feeling that, and I think I'm sure it is today, the feeling that the whole Air Force is behind you, and not only the Air Force but serving, but your senior retired chaps as well. You feel somehow everyone's sort of backing you up, and that's why you've got to try all the harder and live up to their expectations. But it's a very magnificent feeling. It's rather like flying in formation. You're feeling them all behind you.
Yes.
And
there was a comment that Sir Arthur Tedder had made earlier, wasn't there?
Yes, I think it's quite worth mentioning. Is that when I left being VCAS, I went into Tedder's office. He said, there's one thing I want to tell you before you go. You're going to go to the Middle East. He told me that, to take over command. He said, I think you might as well know that it's in the plan, mark you, that you are going to be Chief of the Air Staff after my successor. I'm just telling you this now, not that you will be, but because you'll be able to keep your eyes open a bit wider. Now, just as an illustration of what we chaps in the Air Force feel, I mean, I literally was completely staggered. I truthfully say, the thought had never occurred to my mind. And I blurted something out to this effect to him, and then I added, and frankly, sir, more or less, I think you're making a great mistake, because I'm just not a big enough man. And he gave a look at me with a twinkle, and he said, I know you're not now, but you will be when you feel that responsibility on your shoulders. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Until you really get the job and you feel that responsibility and you've got to live up to it, what everyone expects of you, you are a different man.
Yes. Now, I know, again, sir, there are a lot of points which perhaps at another time, another place, we might have the opportunity to explore about your responsibilities as Chief of Air Staff, but I think we couldn't possibly let you go without asking you to comment on an even higher pinnacle, which is scaled, when you were invited, I think, at the beginning, I just checked, I think 1956, when Sir Anthony Eden invited you to take on a completely different post.
Yes.
The chairman.
We haven't time to say what happened on the Chief of Staff's Committee, not quite.
It would be a little bit short of time,
yes,
sir.
Yes,
I would rather, if I may, concentrate on
in
the last 5 minutes on one or two issues that you were going to be concerned with.
Well, this happened. This came out as a bolt out of the blue, another one. And I was sent for by the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, one day. In number 10, I was alone in his office, and he said, I'm going to tell you something. A decision has been taken, and nothing will alter it. We are going to create a fourth member of the Chief of Staff, a chairman of the Chiefs of Staff's Committee. And I just want to, I'm going to offer you the post. I don't want to say now, but I just want to tell you why we're doing this. We're doing it for roughly 4 reasons. The first thing is, I have no intention, as being Prime Minister, of entering into all the details of defence that my famous predecessor, Winston Churchill, Mr. Churchill, used to do. I just haven't the time for it. I don't think Prime Ministers should. Defence is a highly complicated subject, and it's a whole-time job, and balancing up the priorities between the services. You've got to have a full and responsible Minister of Defence who will work all that out. The Prime Minister and Defence Committee can always sort of alter it if they don't like it. But I can't do it myself. That's one reason. So I must have a strong Minister of Defence. Now, I can't have a strong Minister of Defence alone there. I know he'll work with the Chiefs of Staff's Committee, but he's got a civil service. I can't have him alone there without a military advisor. I can't bring in someone from retired life who's got out of touch with that sort of thing. And therefore, who is the military advisor to be? We just can't leave it to civil servants. He's got to be properly advised, and we have decided that one of the Chiefs of Staff should be there. And the best arrangement is what I've just said. The Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff should have the dual role of being the Chief Staff Officer, advisor of the Minister of Defence, and also Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff. And that is why we're doing this. We think it doesn't upset the Chief of Staff's Committee's very traditional position, and that's how it's going to work in the future. So that's the decision of the Cabinet, and will you take the post? Well, he said, give me 24 hours to think about it. Well, of course, 2 of my colleagues didn't like that very much. They thought of the Chiefs of Staffs in the war, and this traditional thing was a terrible thing. But I agreed to it and did take the post for this reason. That one is, I was Chairman of the Chiefs of Staffs at that time, as CAS. I was quite convinced that the Prime Minister's arguments were correct, that if there was going to be a Minister of Defence with much fuller powers than had before, it was absolutely essential for him to be tied into the Chiefs of Staff's Committee. I had no faith in the Chiefs of Staff's Committee being able to give sort of financial advice to the Minister, because these days, with the tightening of the defence budget, the Chiefs of Staffs can't quite agree about allocations of monies and things. It's got to be worked out with the civil servants, that sort of thing. But by making the chairmen, as I've said just before, the chairman of the Chiefs of Staffs, the chief military advisor to the minister, chairman of the Chiefs of Staffs, you bound that individual into the Chiefs of Staffs organisation with the traditional responsibilities of giving collective advice to the government, and that would, in a way, ensure that he did give responsible advice to the minister, which would be largely in accord with what the Chiefs of Staff felt. And my lastly, the most important point, really, from my point of view, is that I had found my own experience that it was impracticable for one of the heads of the services, in my case I was CAS, to go on being representing of the Chiefs of Staff on NATO Military Committee, on the CATO Military Committee, on the Centre, or the Baghdad Pact became the Centre Military Committee, and with all that work implied, with a new Minister of Defence advising him and managing the Chief of Staff's business, you could not do all that work without detracting your responsibilities towards the Air Force or the Army or the Navy. And therefore I accept it, and I still think, and I think everyone else really given it any thought thinks it was the right decision, the right compromise. How it's worked out is another matter.
Yes, it was an astonishing coincidence, really, that later that year, and in a very, very short space of time, that the entire system should have been given such a strenuous test, which couldn't possibly have been foreseen. The Suez, the Operation Musketeer. I wonder if we could just spend a couple of minutes on that, sir, because I know that the book, for example, by Mr. Selwyn Lloyd has covered a large amount of the ground, but there are still misunderstandings about just what the Royal Air Force was asked to do and how efficiently it carried it out.
Yes.
And If, again, very briefly, you could just...
I know, because very briefly is the word. The serious story is a very long one, and of course we mustn't be drawn into it, you and I, as to the rights and wrongs of it and all that. Now, just one or two words of the series in relation to the Chief of Staff's Committee. Now, right from the very night when the Prime Minister was dining the King of Iraq on I think it was the 26th of July, 1956, I think it was the 26th, and when the Nasser announced his seizure of the canal, from that very moment until he resigned in November, the Prime Minister had to, because of the highly political thing of the whole business.
That he aroused as well.
He took absolutely personal control of everything, and he had to. And so, even that night, the Chiefs of Staff was sent for that very night. But to start with, the Chief of Staff hadn't got much to do. We were told that they would try and deal with the thing politically, and, you know, movements towards the Americans and the Security Council and all the rest of it. And the Chiefs of Staff were told to prepare plans for military action just in case the political negotiations failed. And so we began to get down to it. But then, of course, there came the time was slipping by, the French were putting great pressures on because they were desperately wanting to do an operation. And for the government, we had a special committee, the Prime Minister and his serious committee, to make up their minds what plan it should be. And it's very interesting how the minds of ministers and the Chiefs of Staffs, how they interact on each other and help each other. Because at the Staff College, as you know, every military operation must have a political aim. But in deciding on that political aim, you've got to take into account the military factors. Yes. Now, sitting down at that table, they had roughly to, and it came out, and it never came out really in any book, not even in Selwyn Lloyd's book, that the aim of the British government, and preeminently the French government, was to topple Nasser off his position of power. Now, how to achieve that? Well, we consulted, and three ways emerged of doing this. The first one was to seize Alexandria, and perhaps, if necessary, if that didn't topple Nasser by itself, to advance on to Cairo and to overthrow him that way. Well, then we explained that, how that plan would put into effect. There was no difficulty in taking the harbour. There was no real difficulty in getting ashore, putting our forces ashore at Alexandria, but it would need some bombardment and some fighting, and civil casualties, some civil casualties were inevitable in a crowded place like that. Yes. Well, the more that ministers looked at that, they decided internationally, politically, that it was out. The other one was to join up with the Israelis, which what the French, I think, wanted to do, and that would be a much easier military operation, and to come along with the Israelis and supporting them and advance across Sinai and leave them behind and take the canal. That was completely out from our point of view. We couldn't possibly side with the Israelis because we had the whole Arab world against us, and goodness knows what would happen. And the third one was the operation, what should we call, Musketeer. Seize Port Said with the British-French force and advance down the canal to Suez and capture the canal, and with the Israelis putting in a diversion to contain the Egyptian army. And well, now, what are we going to, how much we want? The political control got tighter and tighter because, you see, as it became evident to the world, America and the United Nations, that this military expedition, the French announcement, was beginning to take shape, it might take place, the whole commission began to boil over. And that's where the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff, thing we discussed just now, it really came into its own. It really showed its value. Because the Prime Minister was wanting military advice all day long and sometimes in the middle of the night. Yes. You can't assemble 4 Chiefs of Staffs together. Yes. And so the Chairman of the Chiefs of Staffs had to represent the views of the Chiefs, go to see the Prime Minister half a dozen times a day, and then convey his instructions to them. The Chiefs of Staffs were meeting every day as well. And that was it. But then again, we came to the moment when the operation started, when the Prime Minister was completely the Commander-in-Chief, really watching it. And then, to give you an example of how tightly things were bound up, was in the middle of Bomber Command's operation to neutralize the Egyptian Air Force. Right in the middle of it, suddenly we got a telegram from the ambassador, our ambassador in Cairo, to the effect that he'd just heard that the American ambassador, with his whole entourage, was going to evacuate Cairo and go to Alexandria. Now, it so happened that the road between Cairo and Alexandria passed close to one of the airfields we were due to bomb that afternoon or that night, I can't remember. And of course, when I got on the Prime Minister and told him this, having the Americans bombed there would absolutely upset everything.
Bombing the American ambassador.
So immediately he said, you stop the bombing at once. Tonight, no more bombing. So then I got on to the CS, and he said he thought it was too late, but he'd try, and he got on to Malta, where we were operating from, and he managed to stop the majority leaving the ground, and not only that, he managed to recall those who were already on their way.
Yes.
And things were happening like that all the way along. And incidentally, Bomber Command's operation to neutralize the Egyptian Air Force on that occasion was one of the, I think, the most successful, efficient operations Bomber Command's ever undertaken. I mean, they took out, or they, what's the word? Neutralized every single one of those Delta airfields with very great, considerable bombing accuracy, to such an extent, so far as we know, there were no civilian casualties outside, possibly civilians inside the airfield perimeters. It was a magnificent operation.
Yes.
And so we went on to the end when Musketeer itself was, I don't mind saying so myself, was a complete military success.
Yes.
We made our landing with comparatively few casualties at port side. There was a slight little hiccup in the middle. Then we advanced down towards thing. We easily got to Suez. We were halfway there, just short of Ismailia, when political factors intervened. The United Nations overboiled, and the Prime Minister had to put his hands up for economical, mostly for economical reasons, finance and all that, and the run of the pound. And we had to agree a ceasefire. Yes. So it was a military success, but you could weigh it up in Selby's book.
Yes, quite. And of course the political implications are for a different time, a different place.
But it does awfully illustrate how closely chiefs of staffs and ministers have got to be tied together in all military operations, how service chiefs and officers have got to be tuned to the agonies that ministers go through, be able to stand up to them, be able to help them. You know, they're very much these days are linked together.
Yes, yes, indeed. Well, sir, I regret to state that we're coming very, very near the end of our time.
Oh, dear,
and I would very much like to have gone on to examine in considerable detail the 1957 Defence White Paper, but I think we must ask you at this point if we could probably persuade you to come along from Newbury perhaps for a third time, just for a few minutes, just to say a little bit more, because I know that also you have some very carefully and long thought out views on not only the longer term significance of Trenchard, but an enduring influence of air power, and perhaps we could save those views for another time. Unless you'd like just to make one final comment. I know you have looked back at Trenchard and the enduring significance, perhaps on his thoughts on the impact on World War II.
How much longer have we got?
Probably just a minute or so, that's all, I'm afraid.
I can't tell you what I really feel about how those concepts of the Trenchard, how they were really came to magnificent fruition in the last war.
I think it would be asking too much, sir, and I think all really what I should do now is attempt very quickly to draw a lot of strands together in thanking you very, very much indeed for coming to talk to us and talk with us this afternoon. It seems to me that you reached a pinnacle of a career which has spanned 44 years, we said, of operational experience, which was constantly intermingled with a broadening of experience. And the using of what we now call staff skills, both in an individual service environment, a combined service environment. And again, I can only say that I hope we can ask you again to reflect further specifically on this monumental defence-wide policy decision that was taken in 1957 and the significance, and perhaps mistaken significance, it's had since that time. But for now, sir, thank you very much indeed, Sir William, for being with us.
Can I add one word to that?
Yes, please.
I think that in your questions to me and my answers, we may have given the impression between us that, I won't say it's been flattery, but it's come out in a way, because of the high position I held, that I was a sort of star. Now, I just want to, no due sense of humility, to make out quite clearly that is wrong. I was just one amongst many typical chaps in between the wars. I happened to be in certain places, right places at the right time, but please don't let that impression go down on the records. That, just because I happen to get to those things, I really mean that. That when I think of all the people that you could have had in the screen, the people who really, all my predecessors who have all passed along now, and you started this series too late in a way to get them, and those are the people who put the Air Force and made the Air Force ready for the last war, and they were the stars, and we were one of the satellites who helped them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
We can upset the camera. I had to see it.